Hi, in this module, we're going to see how to create a custom interface asset in JavaScript. Before we start, let's have a look at some important information. A JavaScript interface asset will work on all the platforms supported by Intuiface. Still, I recommend you to test your interface asset on the targeted platform, since an iPad may behave slightly differently than an Android device, for example. Second, JavaScript development skills are required to follow this module. Let's start by creating the interface asset itself. To do that, I recommend you to start on our Help Center article, How to Create a JavaScript Interface Asset. The article contains very valuable resources, including one in the very first section, this source code example. The easiest way to create your code will be to download this sample and modify it to your needs. Let's do that. I just opened this folder in Visual Studio Code, a free editor to edit your JavaScript code. Let's have a look at these three different files. The first one is event emitter, and this is a file you're not going to change at all, but you're going to use in every single interface asset you want to create for Intuiface. Moving on is the simple counter IFD. This is the interface descriptor, and if you have seen the module about creating a .NET interface asset, you remember that this file was automatically generated for a .NET piece of code. In this case, you will have to edit this file manually, which is why I recommend you to start from this sample and then adapt it to your own needs. The job of this descriptor is actually to tell Intuiface Composer what are the files which needs to be loaded, what are the properties available, as well as the methods, which will appear as actions in Composer, and the events, which will appear as triggers in Composer. The last one, superencounter.js, is actually the most important file. This will contain your code and define the behavior of your interface asset. For this module, we are going to recreate a random number generator. So the first step will be to rename the classes and the files accordingly to your needs. You can also delete all the actions or properties we will not need for our scenario. So now that we have the right file names and the right class name, let's add the property we will need. We want to generate a random number, so we will need to have a generated number property. Let's initialize it to 0 in the constructor. The second thing we'll need will be an action in Composer to ask this interface asset to generate a new number between a minimum and maximum value. Note that this class is using the prototype mechanism of JavaScript and inherits from the event emitter. This is really important for the interface asset to work properly in Composer. The action we just created will be called generate and has two parameters, a min and a max value. We are then assigning a new value to our generated number and then raising two events using the emit function of our event emitter. The first one is based on the naming convention, which will be the name of your property, in our case generated number, concatenated with the word changed, uppercase C. This will be used by Composer to refresh a value on which there is a binding attached. In this case, let's say you have a text asset bound to the generated number property. If you want the text to be refreshed, you need to tell Composer, hey, there is a new value here. The second one is completely optional. I'm just adding it here as a basic trigger to show you that you can raise any kind of triggers using the same emit function. We will use this in Composer to display a feedback that, hey, a new number has been generated. Having a quick look at the descriptor, you will see that the generated property is described as a property in the schema section of the descriptor, while the generated action and its two parameters is described in the resources. For more details on how to write your own interface asset descriptor, please refer to the Help Center articles. Our code is ready to be tested. Let's add it into Composer. On the left-hand side, this is the folder with my source code, the three files we just wrote. On the right-hand side, you have the folder My Documents, Interface, Interface Assets. This is where you need to copy the folder containing your files. Make sure you do not copy just the files, but embed them into a folder. So let's take this one, copy and paste. That's it. You can now launch Composer. Once Composer is open, you can create a new project to test your work. Open the Add an Interface Asset panel and search for Random. This is the one which we have just created. Select it and click on the Add button. We can check in the Extra panel that we do have a generated number property, a number generated trigger, and an action generate with two parameters, minimum value and maximum value. Let's now see how to debug and test your work. The first thing you want to do is to visualize this number. You can directly do a drag and drop from the Extra panel to the scene. You can also create a text asset and manually bind the property to the random number generator. We then need a button to generate a new value. This button will actually call an action on the interface asset called generate. Let's ask for a value between 0 and 10. Before hitting the play button, you would have to open the project menu and select Simulate Player on other platforms. Even if you're targeting a Windows platform, this will be really helpful for you to debug your work. Now hit play. First thing, click on the Generate button. We seem to get random values somewhere between 0 and 10. Looks good. If you had an issue or a more complex interface asset and you want to debug what's going on while being in play mode, you can press the shortcut Ctrl-Shift-I on your keyboard. This will open the Chrome developer tools you might be used to. In this tool, use the Ctrl-P shortcut to open a file and search for your random number generator.js file. You have access to your source code and you can add breakpoints. Let me add a breakpoint here at this first line. Now when I click on the Generate button, you can see the breakpoint stopped. I can go over this and go step by step. I can check the value of this generated number. So the new value is going to be 8, and I can then debug my code. Click on Resume to actually see the result in Composer. To conclude this module, I would like to focus on two specific sections of the Help Center article, the limitations and the interface factory. The JavaScript you're going to write this interface asset, especially if you're going to run on a player for Windows, is going to be interpreted by the Chrome V8 engine, which is only a JavaScript engine, not a full web browser. This means you can only use what is commonly called vanilla JavaScript. You don't have access to libraries like jQuery, Dojo, and so on. You cannot also rely on Node.js server running inside the experience. To compensate this limitation, we created the Interface Factory, which will offer some services through a factory mechanism to access something like the file system or sending web requests, etc. For more information, please refer to this specific article.